Section 1. The soft hum of a luxury car's engine filled the long, winding driveway leading up to the Carter estate, its headlights cutting through the evening mist. Olivia Dawson gripped the strap of her bag tightly, staring up at the grand mansion before her. The towering structure was as imposing as she had imagined, a modern fortress of glass and steel, sleek yet elegant, much like the man who owned it. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. This was just another job, another opportunity, another family that needed a tutor for their child. Nothing more. Except, deep down, she knew that wasn't true. It had been 5 years. 5 long years since she had walked away from this world, since she had walked away from him. And now, fate had thrown her right back into his life. The moment she stepped out of the car, a cold breeze rushed past, making her shiver, not just from the wind, but from the memories that threatened to resurface. The laughter, the late-night whispers, the promises that had never been fulfilled. But she couldn't allow herself to get lost in the past. Not now. Not when she had fought so hard to rebuild her life. "Miss Dawson," a voice pulled her from her thoughts. A butler in a crisp uniform stood by the entrance, his face impassive but professional. He had likely seen countless people come and go from this house. To him, she was just another employee. "Yes, that's me." Olivia forced a smile, straightening her posture. "Mr. Carter is expecting you," he said, stepping aside to allow her in. "Miss Sophie is in the study." Sophie. The name alone made Olivia's heart ache. She had seen the child's file before accepting the position. Sophie Carter, 5 years old, bright and curious but withdrawn in social settings. A little girl who, by some cruel twist of fate, had no idea who she truly was to Olivia. As she stepped inside, the warm, inviting glow of chandeliers bathed the interior in golden light. Everything about the Carter estate screamed power and wealth, but it wasn't just the decor. It was the energy in the air. The knowledge that the man who lived here was someone who controlled entire industries with a single decision. The butler led Olivia down a long hallway, their footsteps echoing against the marble floors. She could barely hear anything from the other rooms. No voices, no laughter, just an eerie silence. Then, as they reached a grand oak door, he stopped. "Miss Sophie is inside. Mr. Carter will join you shortly." Olivia nodded, though her hands felt cold. "Thank you." The door creaked slightly as she pushed it open. Inside, a little girl sat on a plush armchair, her tiny hands wrapped around a book that seemed far too advanced for her age. She had soft brown curls framing her delicate face, and when she looked up, Olivia felt the air leave her lungs. Sophie's eyes. They were the same striking green that Olivia had seen in the mirror her entire life. Her daughter. Olivia had known it, had prepared herself for it, but nothing could have truly readied her for the overwhelming wave of emotions that crashed over her. Sophie studied her, her small brows furrowing. "Are you my new teacher?" Her voice was soft, hesitant, as if unsure of how to interact with strangers. Olivia swallowed hard, forcing her emotions into a tight box. "Yes, my name is Miss Olivia. It's very nice to meet you." Sophie hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Okay." The little girl didn't smile, but there was curiosity in her expression. Olivia knew from the file that Sophie wasn't used to forming attachments easily. She had been raised in a world where people came and went. Nannies, tutors, house staff, none of whom stayed long enough to make an impact. But Olivia wasn't just another tutor. She had to be careful. She couldn't let Sophie see the truth, the love, the longing, the guilt that weighed on her every day. She had made a choice all those years ago, and now she had to live with it. They settled into an easy rhythm as Olivia introduced the lesson plan, asking Sophie about her interests. The little girl was quiet at first, but eventually began answering in short, precise sentences. "I like stories," Sophie admitted when Olivia asked her about books. Olivia smiled, nodding. "Stories are wonderful. They take us to places we've never been before." Sophie glanced at her book. "But they always have endings." Something about the way she said it made Olivia's heart clench. "Yes," she murmured, "but sometimes endings are just new beginnings in disguise." Before Sophie could respond, the door behind them opened. The air in the room shifted. A presence, a shadow. Olivia felt it before she even turned around. And then she heard his voice. "Miss Dawson." Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly she turned. Daniel Carter stood in the doorway, looking every bit the powerful man he had become. He had always been devastatingly handsome, but time had sharpened his features, making him even more commanding. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a tailored black suit that fit him like a second skin, he was a man who could silence a room with just a look. But it wasn't just his presence that sent a shiver down her spine. It was his eyes, piercing, searching, unreadable. For a moment, time seemed to stretch between them. 5 years. 5 years since she had last seen him, since she had left without a word, since she had disappeared from his life, taking with her a secret he never knew existed. Olivia forced herself to keep her expression neutral. Mr. Carter. Daniel's gaze didn't waver. His face remained unreadable, but there was something in his posture, something just beneath the surface, a flicker of recognition. "Miss Dawson," he said again, his voice slow and deliberate. "I wasn't expecting you to be so familiar." Olivia's pulse hammered in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "I assure you, we've never met before. Lies, a dangerous game." Daniel studied her for a long moment before nodding, though something in his eyes told her he didn't quite believe her. "Very well," he said finally. "We'll see how this works out." Then, without another word, he turned and left, leaving Olivia standing there with her heart racing. As the door clicked shut, she released a shaky breath. Daniel Carter didn't recognize her. Not yet. But it was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down. And when that happened, Olivia wasn't sure if she would survive it. Section 2. The air in the study remained thick with unspoken tension long after Daniel had left. Olivia forced herself to breathe, steadying her hands as she turned back to Sophie, who had been quietly watching their exchange. The little girl's expression was curious but not suspicious. Thankfully, Olivia knew she had only bought herself a little time. Daniel might not have recognized her immediately, but it wouldn't take him long. He wasn't the kind of man who let things slide, especially not when something or someone seemed even slightly out of place. She needed to be careful. She needed to stay composed. She needed to remember why she was here. Sophie, she was the only reason Olivia had taken this job. After years of searching, after endless nights spent wondering what kind of life her daughter was living, fate had led her here. She couldn't waste this opportunity. Sophie tilted her head. "You looked scared." Olivia's breath hitched slightly at the child's words. Scared. Yes, she was, but not for the reasons Sophie might think. She forced a smile. "Oh, what makes you say that?" Sophie shrugged, looking back at her book. "That's how people look when Daddy is around. They get nervous." A pang of guilt sliced through Olivia's chest. Was that how Sophie saw her father? A man who made people uneasy? She had no doubt Daniel had grown colder over the years. She had seen it in his eyes, heard it in his voice, but he had once been different. At least she thought he had been. Olivia swallowed down the memories. This wasn't the time for nostalgia. "Well," she said gently, "I was just surprised to see him. He's a very important man, isn't he?" Sophie nodded, flipping a page in her book. "People always listen to him. He makes all the rules, even when I don't want them." Something in the little girl's voice sounded resigned, and Olivia's heart clenched. Before she could respond, a soft knock sounded at the door. The butler appeared again, his expression unreadable. "Miss Dawson, Mr. Carter requests your presence in his office." Olivia's stomach dropped. It was happening sooner than she expected. She pasted on a calm expression and nodded. "Of course." Sophie glanced up, her brows furrowing. "You're coming back, right?" The quiet uncertainty in her voice nearly broke Olivia. "Yes," she promised. "I'll be right back." She followed the butler down the halls, her pulse quickening with every step. The mansion was silent, save for the distant ticking of an antique clock. The deeper they walked into the house, the more Olivia felt the weight of Daniel's presence pressing down on her. By the time they reached his office doors, she had to force herself to remain steady. The butler knocked once before stepping aside to let her in. Inside, Daniel stood near the grand window, his back to her. The city lights cast long shadows across the office, the glow of his desk lamp the only real source of warmth in the otherwise cold space. For a long moment he said nothing. Olivia remained by the door, waiting. Finally he turned. His gaze swept over her again as if searching for something just beyond his reach. She felt exposed under his scrutiny, but she met his eyes head on. "You've done your research," he said after a moment. Olivia's brow furrowed. "Excuse me?" Daniel leaned against the edge of his desk, crossing his arms. "Sophie's tutors don't just get hired out of nowhere. I have an extensive vetting process. And yet somehow, you were selected. Olivia remained still. I applied like anyone else. His lips curled slightly, but there was no warmth in his expression. And yet, I find it hard to believe this is a coincidence. Olivia forced herself to remain calm. She had prepared for this. She knew he would be suspicious. I assure you, Mr. Carter, she said evenly, I'm just here to teach your daughter. Daniel didn't move, but something flickered in his gaze. Something dark, something unreadable. You remind me of someone, he murmured. The words sent a chill down Olivia's spine. She had spent years dreading this moment, wondering what would happen if Daniel ever found out the truth. And now, standing here, looking into the eyes of the man she had once loved, she realized something terrifying. He was already beginning to remember. He might not recognize her fully yet, but he would. It was only a matter of time. Olivia forced a polite smile. I wouldn't know about that. Daniel pushed off the desk, closing the distance between them in slow, deliberate steps. He stopped just a foot away, his presence overwhelming. You're not afraid of me, he observed. The way he said it wasn't a question, it was an assessment. Olivia lifted her chin. Should I be? His lips twitched slightly as if amused. Most people are. Then I suppose I'm not most people. His eyes darkened slightly, but there was a flicker of intrigue behind the coldness. You intrigue me, Miss Dawson, he admitted, his voice lower now. And I don't like things that intrigue me. Olivia's pulse pounded in her ears, but she refused to back down. I'm just here to do my job. For now. The way he said it sent another shiver down her spine. It was a warning, a promise. Daniel Carter wasn't the kind of man who let mysteries go unsolved, and Olivia had just become his biggest mystery yet. She needed to be careful, because once Daniel started searching for the truth, he wouldn't stop until he found it. Section 3. Olivia left Daniel's office with steady steps, but the moment she turned the corner, she exhaled shakily. Her hands trembled slightly as she clenched them into fists, forcing herself to stay composed. It had taken all of her willpower to stand in front of Daniel without giving herself away. The intensity in his gaze, the way his voice dipped into that dangerously curious tone. She knew him well enough to understand what that meant. Daniel Carter was intrigued by her, and that was a problem. Because if there was one thing she remembered about him, it was that he didn't let go of things easily. Olivia leaned against the hallway wall for a brief moment, trying to steady her racing thoughts. She had to be more careful. If he was already suspicious, it wouldn't take much for him to start digging, and if he dug too deep, he would find out the truth, about who she really was, about why she had disappeared years ago, and about the child he never knew existed. Her heart clenched at the thought. Sophie. It was ironic, really. The very thing she had been trying to protect, their daughter, was what had led her straight back into Daniel's world. She had to be smart, careful. She had to keep him at a distance. With a deep breath, Olivia straightened and made her way back toward Sophie's study room. When she opened the door, she was met with two expectant brown eyes staring at her. Sophie was sitting cross-legged on the floor, her book open on her lap, but she was clearly not reading it. Instead, she was waiting for Olivia's return, her expression cautious. You're back, Sophie said. Olivia smiled. Of course, I promised, didn't I? The little girl bit her lip as if unsure whether to believe her. Olivia walked forward and knelt beside her. Sophie, I need you to trust me, okay? I'll always come back. Sophie hesitated, then nodded. Okay. A warm feeling settled in Olivia's chest. She had spent years watching Sophie from a distance, unable to be in her life, and now, even if it was just as her tutor, she finally had the chance to be close to her daughter, and she wasn't going to waste it. Now, Olivia said, reaching for the book in Sophie's lap, shall we continue where we left off? Sophie nodded eagerly, and for the next hour, Olivia focused on teaching. For the first time that day, she felt at peace. But that peace was short-lived, because outside the study room, Daniel Carter stood quietly, his sharp blue eyes watching through the slightly open door. And in that moment he knew, without a doubt, there was something about Olivia Dawson that wasn't as simple as it seemed. Daniel had always been a man who trusted his instincts, and right now his instincts were screaming at him. He had spent his entire career analyzing people, understanding their weaknesses and motivations. It was what made him successful. It was why he was the CEO of Carter Enterprises. And right now, everything in him was telling him that Olivia Dawson was hiding something. She was too composed, too poised, and the way she had looked at Sophie, there had been something there, something deeper than just a tutor caring for her student. Daniel leaned back in his leather chair, tapping his fingers against his desk as he thought. He hadn't recognized her at first, but there was something eerily familiar about her. The shape of her face, the way she carried herself, even the way she spoke. It was almost as if he had heard her voice before, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't place her, and that frustrated him. Daniel Carter did not forget people. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. A few rings later, a deep male voice answered. "Mr. Carter?" Daniel's tone was sharp. "I need a background check on Olivia Dawson. Everything you can find. Send it to me by tomorrow morning." There was a pause on the other end. "Understood, sir." Daniel hung up without another word. If Olivia Dawson was keeping secrets, he would find out. And when he did, she wouldn't be able to hide anymore. The next morning, Olivia arrived at the Carter estate early, as she always did. She spent her commute reminding herself of her priorities. Stay composed, don't draw attention, and most importantly, stay away from Daniel Carter. But as soon as she stepped inside, she knew that last one was going to be impossible, because Daniel was waiting for her. She barely had time to set her bag down before she heard his deep, commanding voice. "Miss Dawson." She turned, schooling her expression into polite neutrality. Daniel stood near the staircase, his arms crossed, his gaze unreadable. "I'd like to have a word." Olivia's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Of course," she said smoothly. He turned and walked toward his office without another word, expecting her to follow. She hesitated for half a second before steeling herself and stepping inside. The moment the door shut behind them, Daniel turned to her, his gaze piercing. "I had a background check done on you." Olivia's breath caught in her throat, but she kept her expression neutral. "Oh?" she said. "That seems rather excessive for a tutor, don't you think?" Daniel leaned back against his desk, watching her closely. "Perhaps. But you see, I don't like surprises." Olivia lifted a brow. "And did you find anything surprising?" Daniel's lips curved slightly. "No." She felt the slightest bit of relief, but it was short-lived. "I did find it strange, however," he continued, "that before 5 years ago, Olivia Dawson didn't exist." A chill ran down her spine. She forced a small smile. "I wasn't aware my life was of such great interest to you, Mr. Carter." Daniel didn't smile. Instead, he stepped closer. "You're hiding something." Olivia's heart pounded, but she didn't back down. She met his gaze directly, her expression cool. "And what exactly do you think I'm hiding?" Daniel studied her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he smirked. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I intend to find out." Olivia knew then without a doubt that she was in trouble, because Daniel Carter was officially on the hunt, and she was his target. Section 4. Olivia maintained her calm facade as she left Daniel's office, but inside, panic gnawed at her. He was getting too close, too suspicious. She had always known there was a risk in coming here, but she had underestimated just how sharp Daniel's instincts were. He was already digging, and it was only a matter of time before he uncovered the truth. She needed to figure out a way to throw him off before it was too late. As she walked down the long hallway, her mind raced with possible solutions. She couldn't afford to let him connect the dots. Not yet, but she also couldn't quit. If she left now, it would only make him more determined to chase the truth. She had to stay. She had to act like nothing was wrong. Taking a deep breath, she pushed her shoulders back and made her way toward Sophie's study room. If there was one thing she could count on, it was the fact that spending time with her daughter would ground her. When she entered, Sophie looked up and beamed. "Miss Dawson, you're here." Olivia smiled. "Of course I am. Are you ready for today's lesson?" Sophie nodded eagerly. "Yes, but first I made something for you." She scrambled off her chair and ran to her desk, pulling out a piece of paper. She rushed back and held it out with both hands. Olivia took the paper and felt her heart squeeze. It was a drawing, a child's sketch of a woman with long brown hair holding hands with a little girl with blonde curls. The woman in the drawing had a bright red heart on her chest, as if to show she was special. Olivia swallowed hard. "Do you like it?" Sophie asked, bouncing slightly on her feet. "I love it," Olivia said softly, forcing herself to keep her emotions in check. "It's beautiful, Sophie." "Thank you." Sophie grinned. "It's because you're my favorite teacher." Olivia's throat tightened. She had always dreamed of moments like this, being part of her daughter's life, hearing her call her something, anything, even if it was just Miss Dawson. And yet there was an unshakable sadness beneath the warmth, because this wasn't how it was supposed to be. She should have been there all along. From the moment Sophie took her first steps, spoke her first words, she should have been able to tuck her in at night, soothe her when she was sick, kiss her goodnight. But instead she had spent 5 years watching from the shadows, and now here she was, so close yet still forced to pretend. She forced herself to smile. "All right, shall we start?" Sophie nodded enthusiastically, climbing back into her seat. For the next hour, Olivia pushed aside her emotions and focused on teaching, and for a little while, everything felt normal, until the door creaked open. Olivia's heart nearly stopped when she saw Daniel leaning against the doorway, arms crossed. Sophie turned and brightened. "Daddy!" Daniel's gaze flickered to his daughter before landing on Olivia. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said smoothly. "I was just passing by." Sophie beamed. "Miss Dawson was teaching me about space. Did you know that Jupiter has a big storm that's been going for hundreds of years?" Daniel smirked. "Is that so?" "Yes, and Miss Dawson says it's called the Great Red Spot." Daniel's eyes met Olivia's. "I see she's learning a lot." Olivia forced herself to stay composed. "She's a very bright girl." Daniel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying her as if trying to see beyond the words. It made Olivia uneasy. "Well," Daniel finally said, "I won't keep you." But just before he left, he looked at Olivia one last time, his blue eyes dark with quiet intensity. "We'll talk later." Then he was gone. Olivia exhaled slowly, her heartbeat uneven. She had the distinct feeling that whatever conversation Daniel wanted to have next would be even more dangerous than the last. That night, Daniel sat in his private study, staring at the file his investigator had sent him. Olivia Dawson, or rather, Olivia Carter. 5 years ago, she had been someone else entirely, and then suddenly she disappeared. No family, no ties, no history, until she reappeared under a new name as if she had wiped away her past. And now, she was here, in his home, with his daughter. Daniel's jaw tightened. He didn't believe in coincidences. There was something Olivia wasn't telling him, and he would find out what it was. The next morning, Olivia was walking through the estate gardens when she felt a presence behind her. She turned just as Daniel stepped in front of her. "Miss Dawson." Olivia's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. "Mr. Carter." Daniel studied her for a long moment, then finally said, "Take a walk with me." Olivia hesitated. "I have lessons with Sophie." "She's with the housekeeper," Daniel interrupted. "She'll be fine." It wasn't a request. Olivia forced a breath through her nose and nodded. Daniel led her down a stone pathway, the sound of birds chirping in the distance. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then finally, Daniel broke the silence. "You're hiding something," he said casually. Olivia's entire body went rigid. She turned her head slightly. "I don't know what you mean." Daniel let out a low chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "You're careful, I'll give you that," he said. "Most people don't know how to lie to me and keep their composure." Olivia forced herself to stay calm. "Are you accusing me of something?" Daniel stopped walking, and when she turned to face him, he was watching her with an unreadable expression. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I intend to find out." Olivia's stomach churned. She needed to change the subject. "Why does it matter so much to you?" Daniel's jaw clenched. "Because," he said, "I don't like being lied to." A chill ran down her spine. Daniel Carter was a man who always got what he wanted, and right now, he wanted answers. Olivia knew she had to be careful, because if she slipped up even once, he would uncover the truth. And if he did, there would be no going back. Section 5. Olivia barely made it back to her room before her legs gave out. She collapsed onto the edge of the bed, hands trembling as she gripped the sheets. Daniel was onto her. He didn't know the truth yet, but he knew something was wrong. She had expected this. She had always known it was only a matter of time before he started questioning things, but now that it was happening, she felt like she was teetering on the edge of a cliff. How much longer could she keep the truth from him? Olivia had spent years preparing for this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of being so close to him again. Daniel wasn't just the powerful CEO the world knew. He was a man with razor-sharp instincts, a man who didn't trust easily, and right now all of his instincts were telling him she was lying. A soft knock at the door made her jolt upright. She quickly wiped her hands on her skirt, taking a deep breath before answering. To her surprise, it wasn't Daniel. It was Sophie. The little girl peeked up at her, holding a small plate with a cookie on it. "I brought you this," Sophie said shyly. "You looked sad when you left earlier." Olivia's throat tightened. She crouched down to Sophie's level, smiling gently. "That's very sweet of you, Sophie. Thank you." Sophie climbed onto the edge of the bed, swinging her small legs. "Daddy says when people are sad, sometimes food makes them feel better." Olivia's heart clenched. Daniel had always been like that, never one for comforting words, but always showing his care in small, quiet ways. She shook off the thought and focused on Sophie. "Well, this cookie is definitely making me feel better." She took a small bite, exaggerating her enjoyment. Delicious." Sophie giggled. "It's from the kitchen. I didn't bake it or anything." Olivia smiled, brushing a stray curl from Sophie's forehead. "It's still special because you brought it to me." Sophie beamed. A comfortable silence settled between them before Sophie suddenly asked, "Miss Dawson, why don't you like Daddy?" Olivia stiffened. She swallowed, forcing herself to stay calm. "What makes you think that?" Sophie shrugged. "I don't know. He looks at you a lot. And you look at him, but then you always look away." Olivia's pulse quickened. Had Daniel noticed that too? She took a deep breath. "Your father and I are just different people," Sophie pouted. "But I think you're nice, and I think Daddy is nice too." Olivia smiled softly. "He's very lucky to have a daughter like you." Sophie brightened at the compliment. After a moment, she leaned in and whispered, "I think Daddy is lonely." Olivia's breath caught in her throat. "He's always working," Sophie continued. "Even when he's home, he's not really home." She looked down at her lap. "I wish he smiled more." Olivia felt a lump form in her throat. Sophie had no idea how much her words affected her, because Olivia had once wished for the same thing. And for a brief, beautiful moment in the past, she had seen that side of him, the side that wasn't weighed down by business and responsibility, the side that had loved her. But that was a long time ago, a different lifetime. Later that night, Olivia sat by the window in her bedroom, watching the night sky. She couldn't sleep, not when Daniel's words kept echoing in her mind. "You're hiding something, and I intend to find out." He was getting closer, she could feel it. And the worst part? A part of her wanted him to know. A part of her was exhausted from running, from keeping the truth buried. But she wasn't just protecting herself. She was protecting Sophie too. A soft knock made her turn. The door opened and her breath caught when she saw Daniel standing there. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled up. He looked tired, but his blue eyes were sharp, locked onto her as if he could see right through her. "Can we talk?" he asked. Olivia hesitated. She knew what this was. Another attempt to break down her walls. But if she refused, it would only make him more suspicious. So she nodded. Daniel stepped inside, closing the door behind him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, he sighed. "I don't like not knowing things, Olivia." She flinched at the sound of her real name on his lips. He noticed. His eyes darkened. "You react every time I say your name," he murmured. "Like it's a secret you don't want me to uncover." She clenched her fists. "I don't know what you mean." Daniel exhaled through his nose as if trying to hold on to his patience. 5 years ago, he said slowly, "you disappeared. No trace, no explanation. And now you're here, in my home, teaching my daughter." Olivia's breath hitched. Daniel took a step closer. "I don't believe in coincidences," he continued, voice lower now. Olivia's heart pounded. "You knew who I was when you took this job," Daniel said. "Didn't you?" She felt her throat tighten. There it was, the moment she had been dreading. She could lie, she could keep pretending, but the way he was looking at her, it was like he already knew. Olivia lowered her gaze. "Yes." Silence. The air between them crackled with tension. Daniel let out a slow breath. "Why?" His voice was quiet, but there was a sharp edge to it. Olivia closed her eyes. "Because I needed the job." Daniel's jaw clenched. "That's not the whole truth." She didn't respond. Because she couldn't tell him the whole truth. Not yet. Daniel studied her for a long moment, then finally spoke. "If you're hiding something," his voice was quiet but firm, "I will find out. Then he turned and walked out, leaving Olivia alone with the weight of his words. The next day, Olivia was more careful. She kept her distance from Daniel. She avoided being alone with him as much as possible. But she could feel his eyes on her, watching, waiting. He wasn't done with his questions, and sooner or later, he would get his answers. Section 6. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Carter estate, casting golden hues across the grand living room. Olivia stood by the staircase, gripping the railing tightly, trying to gather herself. Sleep had been impossible last night after her conversation with Daniel. The way he had looked at her, sharp, questioning, filled with an unsettling mixture of suspicion and something else, had left her rattled. She knew it was only a matter of time before he pieced everything together. She had to stay ahead of him. A soft giggle snapped Olivia out of her thoughts. Sophie was in the hallway, twirling in a pastel pink dress, her little feet moving in graceful circles. Behind her, Daniel watched, his arms crossed, amusement flickering in his deep blue eyes. "Are you practicing for a dance?" Olivia asked, forcing a casual smile. Sophie turned, her eyes lighting up. "Daddy said we might have a party soon. I need to practice for the dancing part." "A party?" Olivia's stomach clenched. Daniel tilted his head slightly, his gaze locked onto hers. "Yes, a formal event. It's an annual charity gala. I host it every year." Olivia swallowed. That meant guests, people who might recognize her, people who might remember the woman who had been part of Daniel Carter's life years ago. She couldn't afford that kind of attention. "You should come, Miss Dawson," Sophie beamed, running to grab Olivia's hand. "It'll be so fun." Olivia hesitated. Daniel took a slow step closer, his presence commanding, as always. "Yes, Olivia, you should come." His voice was smooth, deliberate, as if daring her to refuse. She clenched her fingers. If she declined too quickly, it would make him more suspicious. So she forced a nod. "I suppose I could come, if you really want me to." Sophie clapped excitedly. "Yay, that means I get to pick a dress for you." Olivia laughed softly, masking the nerves crawling up her spine. She had just placed herself directly in Daniel's path, and she had no idea how she was going to escape this time. The evening of the gala arrived faster than Olivia would have liked. She stood in front of the full-length mirror in her room, her reflection staring back at her. The emerald green dress Sophie had picked out hugged her frame, the delicate lace detail giving her an air of elegance she hadn't felt in years. She barely recognized herself. A soft knock on the door made her jump. Taking a deep breath, she opened it, only to freeze. Daniel stood there, and he looked breathtaking. His black tuxedo was perfectly tailored, his crisp white shirt adding a sharp contrast. But it wasn't his attire that unsettled her. It was the way he was looking at her, like he had seen her before, like he remembered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel stepped forward, his deep voice a whisper against the tension between them. "You look beautiful." Olivia's breath hitched. She dropped her gaze, trying to steady her racing heart. "Thank you," she said softly. Daniel's fingers flexed at his side as if resisting the urge to touch her. Then, finally, he exhaled and offered his arm. "Shall we?" Olivia hesitated but knew she had no choice. She placed her hand lightly on his arm, and together, they walked toward the grand ballroom. The gala was a dazzling affair. Chandeliers cast a warm glow over the polished marble floors. The room buzzed with conversation, laughter, and the clinking of champagne glasses. Olivia kept her steps measured, her expression calm. She couldn't afford to let her nerves show. "Miss Dawson!" A voice called her name. She turned to see an older woman dressed in an elegant navy gown, smiling warmly. "You're Sophie's tutor, aren't you?" "Yes," Olivia responded carefully. "She adores you," the woman said with a knowing smile. "It's rare to see her so attached to someone so quickly." Olivia forced a small chuckle. "She's an easy child to love." From the corner of her eye, she felt Daniel watching her, studying her. She turned slightly, and their eyes met. Something in his expression made her stomach flip. He knew, or at least he was close to knowing. As the evening progressed, Daniel was never far from Olivia's side. He spoke with guests, shook hands with business moguls, but every so often his gaze would drift back to her. It felt like he was waiting for her to slip up. Sophie was in the center of the ballroom, twirling happily as the music played. "Miss Dawson, come dance with me," she called out. Olivia hesitated. "Oh, Before she could refuse, Daniel stepped in. He extended his hand toward her. Dance with me. Her throat tightened. This was dangerous, being this close to him. She should say no, but with Sophie's expectant gaze and Daniel's unwavering eyes, she knew she couldn't. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. The moment his fingers wrapped around hers, a shiver ran through her. Daniel led her to the dance floor, his grip firm yet gentle. The music shifted, a slow, melodic tune filling the room. Olivia swallowed hard as Daniel's other hand settled lightly on her waist. She forced herself to meet his gaze, but that was a mistake, because when she looked into his eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected, a flicker of something deeper, something raw, something dangerous. His fingers tightened slightly against her hand. "You've been avoiding me." Olivia's breath caught. "I haven't," she lied. Daniel's lips curled slightly, but there was no humor in it. "You have, and I want to know why." Her pulse pounded in her ears. She struggled to keep her voice steady. "I don't know what you're talking about." Daniel leaned in slightly, his breath warm against her ear. "I think you do." Olivia shivered. The world around them faded. It was just the two of them, just like it used to be. She felt trapped in the intensity of his gaze, the way his body moved in sync with hers. Memories flooded back, nights spent wrapped in his arms, whispered promises, stolen kisses beneath the city lights. It had all been so real, and yet it had all fallen apart. The song ended, but Daniel didn't let go. His fingers lingered against her waist, his grip still firm on her hand. His eyes darkened. "Tell me, Olivia." His voice was quiet, but there was an urgency to it. "Why did you really leave?" She froze. Daniel had never asked her that before. Not when she had disappeared, not when he had searched for her, but now. Now he was demanding an answer. And Olivia knew she couldn't keep lying forever. Section 7. Olivia's pulse thundered in her ears as Daniel's piercing gaze held her captive. His question, so direct, so full of unspoken pain, hung between them like a storm cloud about to break. "Why did you really leave?" Her throat went dry. She had spent 5 years preparing for this moment, rehearsing her excuses, crafting the perfect lie. But standing here, caught in his unrelenting stare, every carefully constructed wall threatened to crumble. She took a small step back, breaking the physical connection between them. But Daniel wasn't letting go that easily. His fingers flexed at his sides, as if restraining himself from reaching for her again. Olivia hesitated, searching for a way out. "I had my reasons, Daniel." His jaw tightened. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have," she whispered. Frustration flickered across his face. He exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his dark hair. "You expect me to accept that?" His voice was lower now, laced with something raw. "After all these years, after finding you here in my home with my daughter." He stopped abruptly, as if catching himself from saying something he shouldn't. A chill ran down Olivia's spine. Daniel didn't know, not yet, but he was close. She needed to get out of this conversation before she slipped up. "I need to check on Sophie," she said quickly, taking another step back. Daniel didn't move, his gaze still locked onto her like he was trying to read her soul. But finally, after a long, tension-filled moment, he nodded. "Fine," he said, his voice clipped. "But this conversation isn't over." Olivia turned and walked away before he could see the tremble in her hands. She found Sophie outside on the balcony, watching the city lights twinkle below. The little girl's eyes were heavy with sleep, but she refused to go to bed just yet. "Miss Dawson," Sophie yawned, leaning against the balcony railing. "Daddy looks sad." Olivia's chest tightened. "Does he?" Sophie nodded. "He was watching you the whole time." Olivia's breath caught. "Oh?" Sophie giggled sleepily. "Daddy likes you." Her heart lurched. "Sophie." "He does," Sophie insisted. "I think he's lonely." "Lonely." Olivia clenched her jaw, fighting back the wave of emotions threatening to swallow her whole. She wanted to tell Sophie that Daniel had never been lonely, that he had always been surrounded by people, by power, by the kind of life she had never belonged to. But deep down, she knew that wasn't entirely true. Daniel had never let people in. He had always kept his emotions locked away, hidden behind his empire. And maybe, just maybe, she had been the only one who had ever broken through that barrier. Before she could say anything, Sophie let out another yawn and rubbed her eyes. "I should go to bed," she mumbled. Olivia nodded. "Come on, sweetheart, let's get you tucked in." As she led Sophie back inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that tonight had changed something. and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. The next morning, Olivia woke up early, determined to keep her distance from Daniel. She went about her usual routine, preparing Sophie's lessons, organizing materials, and focusing on anything that would keep her mind occupied. But as she made her way down to the kitchen, she froze in the doorway. Daniel was already there, and he wasn't alone. A tall, striking woman stood beside him, her manicured nails wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. She was dressed in an elegant navy dress, her blonde hair swept up in a perfect chignon. Olivia's stomach twisted. Ava Sinclair, Daniel's longtime business associate, and, if the tabloids were to be believed, the woman who had once been rumored to be his fiancée. Olivia swallowed hard, willing herself to stay calm. Daniel glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Good morning," he said smoothly. Ava turned, her gaze sharp as it swept over Olivia. Then she smiled, a perfectly practiced, polite smile. "You must be Sophie's tutor," Ava said, her voice dripping with curiosity. "I've heard so much about you." Olivia forced herself to nod. "Yes, Olivia Dawson." Ava took a sip of her coffee, her eyes lingering on Olivia a second too long. Daniel cleared his throat. "Ava is in town for a few days for business," he explained. "She stopped by for breakfast." Olivia wasn't sure why he felt the need to explain anything to her. It wasn't like she had any right to question who he spent his mornings with. But still, something about the way Ava was looking at her made Olivia's skin crawl. "I see," Olivia said quietly. "Well, I should check on Sophie." Ava's smile widened. "Oh, don't rush off. I'd love to chat with you." Olivia stiffened. Daniel shot Ava a warning look, but the other woman ignored him, setting down her coffee cup with deliberate ease. "You seem familiar," Ava mused, tapping a manicured finger against her chin. "Have we met before?" Olivia's pulse spiked. "I don't believe so," she said, keeping her voice neutral. Ava hummed, her sharp gaze flicking between Olivia and Daniel. Strange." Olivia forced a tight smile, then turned on her heel and walked out of the kitchen. She barely made it around the corner before she let out a shaky breath. Ava recognized her. Maybe not entirely, but enough to be suspicious. And if Ava started digging, it was only a matter of time before Daniel learned the truth. Olivia's hands clenched into fists. She needed to get out of here before it was too late. That evening, Olivia sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the small, worn envelope in her hands. Inside was a one-way plane ticket. She had bought it months ago, just in case, and now she was considering using it. If she left now, she could avoid everything. She could disappear before Daniel uncovered the truth, before Ava started asking more questions, before everything spiraled out of control. But then, what about Sophie? Olivia closed her eyes. She loved that little girl more than anything, and if she left now, she would never see her again. Could she really do that? A soft knock on the door made her jump. She quickly stuffed the envelope back into the drawer before standing up. "Come in," she called. The door opened and Daniel stood there, and her heart stopped. His blue eyes were dark, intense, filled with something she couldn't quite place. "We need to talk," he said, his voice firm. Olivia's breath hitched. She knew in that moment that there was no escaping this. No running and no hiding. Daniel was finally ready for the truth, and she had no choice but to give it to him. Section 8. Olivia stood frozen in place as Daniel's presence filled the room. He had always had that effect. Commanding, unrelenting, but tonight it felt different. There was something dangerous in his gaze, something that told her he had reached his breaking point. "We need to talk," he repeated, his voice low, leaving no room for argument. Olivia swallowed hard. "About what?" Daniel stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The soft click of the lock sent a shiver down her spine. "You know what?" Her pulse quickened. "I don't," she lied, keeping her voice steady. Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair. "I'm done playing this game, Olivia." His blue eyes bore into hers. "I know you're hiding something from me." Her throat tightened. "I'm not." "You are." His tone turned sharp. "And I think I know what it is." Her breath caught. Daniel took a step closer, then another, until there was barely any space between them. His voice dropped to a near whisper. "Sophie isn't just any child, is she?" A chill ran down Olivia's spine. Daniel was too close. His scent, crisp and intoxicating, filled her senses. His piercing blue gaze held her captive, daring her to lie again. She couldn't. Not this time. Olivia took a shaky breath, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "She's mine," she whispered. A muscle in Daniel's jaw twitched. "And mine?" Silence. The air between them was thick, suffocating. Finally, Olivia nodded. Daniel inhaled sharply, his fingers curling at his sides. His entire body stiffened, as if bracing himself against the weight of the truth. "You knew," he murmured, his voice dark with something unreadable. "You knew she was mine, and you kept her from me." Olivia flinched. "I didn't." "You did," he snapped. A sharp wave of guilt crashed over her, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I had my reasons, Daniel." His eyes flashed. "Reasons? What possible reason could you have for taking my daughter away from me?" Olivia took a deep breath. He deserved to know everything. "I found out I was pregnant the night after I left," she admitted. "I wanted to tell you, but—" She hesitated, pressing her lips together. "You were gone. You weren't taking my calls. You made it clear that you had no place for me in your life." Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "So your solution was to disappear?" Olivia's stomach twisted. "I didn't disappear," she whispered. "I survived." His gaze darkened. "You had no right," he said coldly. "No right to make that decision for me." Olivia's eyes burned. "And what would you have done, Daniel?" she shot back. "Would you have dropped your entire empire for us? Would you have suddenly become the perfect father?" He didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. Back then, he wouldn't have. He had been too consumed with his company, too wrapped up in his own ambitions, and she had been nothing more than an inconvenience. Olivia clenched her fists. "I did what I thought was best for Sophie." Daniel let out a slow breath, his eyes filled with something unfamiliar. Pain. Regret. "I missed everything," he said, his voice rough. "Her first steps. Her first words. Every single moment." Olivia's heart twisted. "She doesn't even know who I am," he murmured. A lump formed in her throat. "She knows you," Olivia whispered. "She may not realize it, but she already loves you." Daniel's eyes softened for the first time that night, but only for a second. Then, just as quickly, the steel returned. "This changes everything." Olivia's stomach dropped. "Daniel, I'm not letting you take her away from me again." Her breath hitched. "I wasn't planning to," she whispered. Daniel studied her as if trying to determine whether he could trust her. Finally, he exhaled. "This isn't over." And then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the room. Olivia barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel's face, his anger, his pain. She had prepared for this moment for 5 years, and yet, it still felt like her world was caving in. By morning, she had barely gathered herself together when a knock sounded at her door. She hesitated before opening it. Daniel stood there, looking like he hadn't slept either. "Come with me," he said, and she frowned. "Where?" He didn't answer, instead he stepped aside. And that's when she saw Sophie standing just behind him, beaming up at her. "Miss Dawson, Daddy says we're going on an adventure." Olivia's stomach clenched. Daniel's gaze locked onto hers. "Pack a bag," he said. "We're going home." Home. That word echoed in Olivia's mind as she sat in the back seat of Daniel's sleek black car, watching the city blur past. She should have fought harder. She should have refused. But when Sophie had looked up at her, full of excitement, Olivia knew she couldn't say no. So now she was here, being driven toward the one place she had sworn never to return, Daniel's home. The massive estate loomed ahead, just as breathtaking as she remembered. A towering mansion of glass and stone sitting atop a vast, sprawling property. It was the kind of home that looked like it belonged to a king. And Daniel? He was the king. Sophie practically bounced in her seat. "Wow," she whispered as they pulled through the grand iron gates. "Daddy, do you live in a castle?" Daniel chuckled, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "Something like that, princess." Olivia swallowed hard. As soon as the car stopped, Daniel opened the door and helped Sophie out. Olivia hesitated before stepping out herself. The moment she did, she felt the weight of the past crash down on her. The last time she had been here, she had been in love. And the last time she had left, she had been broken. Daniel turned to her. "I have a room set up for Sophie," he said, "and for you." Olivia stiffened. "I can stay at a hotel." "No." His voice was firm. "You're staying here." She exhaled slowly, realizing that arguing was pointless. Sophie grabbed her hand, tugging her toward the grand entrance. "Come on, Miss Dawson, I want to see my new room." Olivia forced a smile and followed. But as she stepped inside, she knew one thing for certain. Living here, under the same roof as Daniel, was a dangerous mistake, because no matter how much she tried to convince herself otherwise, the past wasn't finished with them yet. Section 9. Olivia had spent years imagining what it would feel like to be back in this house. She had envisioned it in nightmares, in moments of regret, in fleeting thoughts of what if. But now, standing inside Daniel's grand estate, reality was much more suffocating than anything she had imagined. The house was a masterpiece, modern, sleek, and breathtaking. High ceilings stretched above her, chandeliers casting a soft golden glow over polished marble floors. Massive windows framed the lush estate outside, giving a panoramic view of the gardens she once used to wander through aimlessly when she thought she had a future here. She inhaled deeply. This wasn't home, it never had been, and yet she was here again. Sophie, however, was completely unaware of the tension gripping her mother. She gasped in wonder, looking around with wide, fascinated eyes. "Miss Dawson, look, there's a piano, and look at the stairs, so big. Daddy, can I slide down the railing?" Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "Not unless you want to give me a heart attack." Olivia tore her gaze away from the house, focusing on Sophie's excitement. It was a rare thing, and she wouldn't ruin it. "I can show you to your rooms," Daniel said, stepping forward. His voice was calm, but there was something in his eyes, something guarded, unreadable. Olivia nodded stiffly. "Lead the way." Daniel gestured toward the grand staircase, and they ascended in silence. Olivia tried to focus on the intricate details of the house, the artwork on the walls, the way their footsteps echoed against the marble. Anything to stop herself from thinking about what was really happening. She was in Daniel's home, living under his roof. Again. When they reached the second floor, Daniel stopped in front of a set of double doors. He pushed them open, revealing a beautifully furnished room decorated in soft pastels and white lace. Sophie gasped. "This is for me?" Daniel nodded. "Do you like it?" "I love it." Sophie ran inside, twirling in the middle of the plush carpet. "It's like a princess room." Daniel's lips twitched into the smallest smile. "Good, because that's exactly what you are." Olivia's heart clenched. Daniel had missed 5 years of Sophie's life, and yet, in a matter of days, he was already making up for it. Would she ever be able to forgive him for that? Or worse, would she ever forgive herself? Daniel turned to her. "Your room is down the hall." Olivia nodded, following him silently as he led her to another set of doors. He opened them, revealing a room that was far too familiar. She stiffened. Her old bedroom, the very one she had slept in when she had lived here all those years ago. She stepped inside, her fingers brushing over the mahogany dresser, the velvet curtains. Everything was just as she remembered, as if no time had passed at all. "This isn't—" She turned to him, her throat dry. "I can't stay in this room." Daniel leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "It's the only one available." "I highly doubt that," she bit out. He smirked. "Okay, fine. It's the only one available that I'm willing to give you." Olivia clenched her jaw. "Why?" Daniel's expression darkened. "Because you belong here." She let out a shaky breath. "Daniel." "I've already made my decision, Olivia," he interrupted. His voice was firm, unyielding. "You're staying in this room. End of discussion." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that she didn't belong here, that she had no place in his life anymore. But before she could say anything, Sophie's voice rang out from down the hall. "Mommy, come see my new bed." Olivia swallowed her words. This wasn't about her, it was about Sophie. And Sophie was happy, that was all that mattered. She nodded curtly. "Fine." Daniel's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he turned and walked away, leaving Olivia alone in the room that held too many memories. The next few days passed in a strange blur. Sophie was adjusting quickly, running through the massive house like she had lived there her entire life. She followed Daniel around constantly, asking him questions about his work, his house, his favorite foods. And Daniel? He answered every single one, patiently, softly, like a father who had known her forever. It should have warmed Olivia's heart. Instead, it terrified her. Because if Daniel continued like this, she had no doubt that Sophie would love him completely. And if Daniel ever decided to change his mind, if he decided Olivia wasn't fit to be in Sophie's life anymore, then she would lose everything. That was the thought that haunted her the most, which was why she did her best to keep her distance from Daniel. She woke up early, spent the day keeping busy, and avoided him at all costs. But Daniel wasn't stupid. By the end of the week, he had had enough. Olivia had just finished putting Sophie to bed when she walked into the kitchen for some water, but as soon as she stepped inside, she froze. Daniel was leaning against the counter, arms crossed, watching her intently. She hesitated. "What are you doing here?" "I live here." She sighed. "You know what I mean." Daniel pushed off the counter and took a slow step forward. "You've been avoiding me." "No, I haven't." "Yes, you have." She exhaled sharply, gripping the glass of water tightly. "Daniel." "I let it slide the first couple of days," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I let you have your space. But now, I want answers." Her heart pounded. "Answers to what?" His gaze darkened. "To why you're acting like I'm the enemy when all I want is to be in our daughter's life." Olivia looked away. "Are you scared?" Daniel asked softly. Her breath hitched. She should lie, should tell him no, but she was too exhausted to pretend. "Yes," she admitted. Daniel's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Why?" She let out a bitter laugh. "Because this isn't real, Daniel. You're here now, but what happens in a month? What happens when the excitement fades? When you get tired of playing house?" His jaw clenched. "You think I'll leave? Won't you?" she whispered. The room fell into silence. Then, suddenly, Daniel closed the distance between them, stopping mere inches away. She could feel his warmth, could smell the familiar scent of him, and just like that, she was back. Back in the past. Back to the nights she had spent wrapped in his arms, thinking he would always be there. "I'm not leaving," he said, his voice low. "Not again." Olivia swallowed hard. "You say that now," she murmured. Daniel lifted a hand, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. His touch sent a shiver down her spine. "I'll prove it to you," he whispered. Her heart pounded. "Daniel." "I'll prove it, Olivia," he repeated, his voice rough. "No matter how long it takes." She should step back, should put distance between them, but she couldn't, because for the first time in years she wanted to believe him, even if she knew it would break her heart all over again. Section 10. The days following Daniel's quiet promise passed in an unsettling calm. Olivia wasn't sure what to make of it. There were no fights, no raised voices, no cold stares. Instead, Daniel did exactly what he said he would. He stayed. Every morning she woke up to the sound of him moving through the house, helping Sophie get ready for the day. Every evening he was home in time for dinner, sitting across from Olivia at the table like it was the most natural thing in the world. And Sophie had never been happier. She adored Daniel. She followed him around, clinging to every word, laughing at every joke, seeking out his attention at every opportunity. And Daniel? He gave it to her, all of it, without hesitation, without restraint, and Olivia hated it, not because she didn't want Sophie to be happy, but because she knew that if Daniel ever changed his mind, if he ever walked away again, Sophie would never recover from it, which was why she needed to protect her daughter, even if it meant protecting her from the one person she wanted more than anything. That night, Olivia found herself standing in the kitchen, staring at the marble countertop as the weight of everything settled onto her shoulders. She needed to leave, before it was too late, before she got too comfortable, before she started believing that Daniel might actually stay. She had to leave, but just as she turned to go, a deep voice cut through the silence. "You're thinking about running again." She froze. Slowly, she turned around to find Daniel leaning against the doorway, arms crossed over his chest. His blue eyes were locked onto her, sharp and unreadable. She swallowed hard. "I don't know what you're talking about." Daniel let out a humorless chuckle. "Come on, Olivia, we both know that's not true." She clenched her fists. "It's better this way." "For who?" "For Sophie." Daniel's jaw tightened. "That's not your decision to make." "She's my daughter," Olivia bit out. "She's our daughter," Daniel corrected, his voice dangerously low. The word sent a shiver down Olivia's spine. They had spent so long fighting, so long arguing, that she had forgotten what it felt like to hear those words. Our daughter. But it didn't change anything. "She needs stability," Olivia whispered. She needs both of her parents," Daniel interrupted. "She needs us." Olivia inhaled sharply. "I know you don't trust me," he continued, his voice quieter now. "I don't blame you, but I won't let you take her away from me again." She lifted her chin. "What are you going to do? Drag me to court?" Daniel stared at her for a long moment. Then to her surprise, he shook his head. No. She blinked. No. No. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. Because I'm not fighting you, Olivia. I'm choosing you. Her breath caught. Daniel lifted a hand, brushing his fingers against her cheek. I lost you once, he murmured. I won't lose you again. She should move away. Should tell him that it didn't matter, that it was too late, but she couldn't. Because for the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel. Hope. Over the next few weeks, something shifted. Daniel was no longer just there, he was present. He didn't just exist in Sophie's life, he became a part of it. He attended her school events, took her to the park, stayed up late helping her with homework, even when he had $1 million deal waiting for him in the office. And Olivia. She was forced to see him in a way she hadn't before. Not as the ruthless CEO, not as the man who had broken her heart, but as a father, a good father, and she hated how much she loved it. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Sophie curled up beside Daniel with a book in her lap. Daddy, can you read to me? Daniel smiled. Of course, sweetheart. He pulled her onto his lap, flipping open the book. Olivia sat on the other side of the room, watching them quietly. She had spent years trying to convince herself that Daniel would never have been a good father, that she had made the right choice by keeping Sophie away from him. But watching them now, she realized how wrong she had been, and it terrified her, because if Daniel had truly changed, then maybe she had been the one who had made the biggest mistake of all. That night, Olivia stood on the balcony, staring out at the city lights as her thoughts spun in endless circles. She had spent 5 years running, 5 years hiding, but now, for the first time, she was starting to wonder if she had been running from the wrong thing. Couldn't sleep. She turned to find Daniel standing in the doorway. She sighed. Something like that. He stepped forward, stopping beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel exhaled. I meant what I said, you know. Olivia frowned. About what? He turned to her. I'm not going anywhere. Her chest tightened. She wanted to believe him, more than anything, but after everything... Daniel, I love you. Her heart stopped. She stared at him, completely frozen. What? His gaze was steady, unwavering. I love you, he repeated, his voice rough. I never stopped. Tears burned at the back of her eyes. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, he said softly, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn it. A tear slipped down her cheek. For so long she had wanted to hear those words, but now she was too scared to believe them. Because if she let him in, if she let herself hope, and he left again. I don't know if I can do this, she whispered. Daniel reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. You don't have to, he murmured. Not alone. She inhaled shakily, then slowly she nodded. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe, to hope, to love. Months later, as they stood in front of a small altar, Sophie grinned up at them, dressed in a tiny white dress, holding a bouquet far too big for her little hands. Can I be the flower girl and the ring bearer? She asked excitedly. Daniel chuckled. Of course, princess. Sophie beamed, handing the ring to her father. Daniel turned to Olivia, his gaze filled with nothing but love. I, Daniel Carter, take you, Olivia Dawson, to be my wife. Olivia's breath hitched. The man who had once broken her, the man she had sworn she would never forgive, had become the one she loved more than anything. She smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks. I, Olivia Dawson, take you, Daniel Carter, to be my husband. And just like that, they became a family. For real. For always. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Heartwarming tales. Heartwarming tales. Heartwarming